So I don't know if you caught it in that video, but there was a moment where one of the gentlemen said, "Enough is enough." And I'm wondering, when in your own everyday lives do you say, "Enough is enough"? When do you stop and get intentional about what's going on in your world? Recently, I was a full-time graduate student, and I understand that all of you just got back from fall break and that everyone in the balcony is finishing their assignments right now, which is fine. I'm not mad about it. I understand. But there were times when I was in school that I had to stop what I was doing and say, "Enough is enough." I would run from class to a meeting, to another class, to mandatory volunteering, to another meeting, to a social thing, to try to do some homework, and so on and so forth. And the busyness often allowed me to stop thinking about what I was doing. And there were times where I needed to say, "Enough is enough. I have had enough pizza for this week." Or, "I've had enough organic Greek yogurt. I just need to have something else in my body." And I needed to stop and think about who I am and what I'm doing. I'm confident that Dr. Perkins has had many times in his life where he has had to do that. And being able to do it in your everyday life, what has helped me to be able to do it in a more broad sense as well. Despite Dr. Perkins' pledge to never return to the South once he had moved to California, to the Mississippi County, where his brother was murdered for the social crime of being black, he found himself there once more in 1970. And he had come to a place where he knew that he and his children had had enough. And he said, "We've been patient. We've waited for change, but they ain't gonna change until we stand up and be men and women. Stand up and look them straight in the eye and demand our freedom. I don't know about y'all, but me and these children done decided that we ain't gonna take it anymore. We ain't gonna take being second-class citizens. The United States Declaration of Independence says that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And I am a man, and I'm ready to stand and be treated like one." There's actually some simplicity in saying enough is enough, some resolve. It's not a resolve that I have come to easily in life, however, because I'm just busy being busy. And I am a recovering people pleaser. But when I do have these moments of clarity and intentionality, it's pretty powerful. When I was in grad school, I found that God was often asking me to invest in the people I was coming into contact with. Most of my friends at school were not Christian. And for my sake and theirs, God was asking me to value people more than my GPA and status and resume, which was a complete crisis for me. In order to hear God's call, I had to stop and listen. I had to say, "Enough is enough, Z. Sit down. Listen." After I graduated, God asked me to make some hard choices again. Almost exactly a year ago, I knew that enough was enough. God had led me to this very prestigious and coveted job in my field at the time. While I worked with some good people, the hours and the competitive spirit of the environment were really toxic for my health. Quitting your fancy job without having another one is a major buzzkill. Being obedient, however, to the Lord and to his leadings has a euphoric effect at times. It's something special to know that you are in the perfect will of your heavenly Father. So I had an oddly appropriate euphoric buzzkill for several months last year. And again, when I was able to say enough is enough, God led me once more to people and a place I'd never imagined I'd go and a place I never wanted to be. He led me to people, neighbors really, that I did not think I belonged to, nor they to me. He led me to a place that has a peculiar racism, a peculiar feel, and a place that in many ways I am a foreigner. and a place that has, much like I hear about you guys, an outrageous amount of snow. He led this Southern, Baptist-ish, Black, multiracially living woman to Grand Rapids, Michigan.
So I hear that the Gordon College classes have gotten exceptionally more impressive since I graduated several years ago, but I'm 98% sure that there's one competition that I would beat all of you in, and that is the time spent in church. No, it's a competition you wanted to compete in. I grew up in a church, I came to Gordon College, I went to chapel 3 times a week and church, and then, much to my chagrin, 3 weeks after graduating, I found myself working at a church. I found myself working there at a church in Cambridge right at the time that the church was starting to have big dreams about what they might do in the city. Dreams like eradicating poverty, helping to eliminate racial inequality. Great, huge, big, well-intentioned dreams. The only problem with these dreams is that they almost entirely rested on my shoulders. Well, this was one of the problems. And so they either didn't really care about them, or they thought I was really awesome. And maybe the latter is true. Needless to say, I felt a little overwhelmed, and to cope with feeling overwhelmed, I would frequently go on walks. Flash forward several months later, it was a Friday night, and I found myself south of the city at a mosque. It was Ramadan, and my head was covered. I wore my loosest, nicest, most conservative clothes, and my face and feet and hands were recently washed, as is the custom. Several months earlier, on one particularly stressful day, as I typed ferociously at my desk about our church's great big plans for our neighborhood, I felt this nudge to go outside on one of these walks. I met this woman, Syra, on the street. She said hello and invited me over to her house for tea, and I said yes, mainly because I'm from California and I was freezing. I sat there for 3 hours sipping chai with her and her husband, and over that course I learned how they had immigrated to the United States from Africa. They were Indian immigrants to a southern part of Africa where they raised their kids. They moved here later in life. I also learned they just so happened to be a rather big deal in the local Muslim community that lived right next to our church with well-intentioned plans. So she invited me to the mosque, and I thought, aha, a taste of my own medicine. I was one of you during high school who invited everyone to church. So I felt obligated to say yes. Syra told me I could sit in the lobby or go inside with her to the prayer room, and I thought, oh no, I'm going all the way. I want to go inside here. I had enough foresight to sit in the back, and I watched around me as women lined up in rows and knelt and bowed and prayed in perfect unison as if in a lyrical dance. And I kneeled in the back, and I thought, oh no, I will pray for these women, these poor oppressed women who are worshiping the wrong God. So I closed my eyes in the most righteous manner possible. And as I paused to pray, I felt the strongest sense of a voice say, shh, Stephanie, she will teach you everything you need to know. What? Wait, Syra? She will teach me what I need to know? Now, I don't think it was God's way of saying, surprise, Prophet Muhammad is the way. But I do think it was God's way, the beginning of God trying to nudge and challenge me on how I viewed my neighbor. You see, I don't know when I learned in my 22 years from either being a Christian, having a college degree, or being white that I would have the answer to everything about everything, from religion to politics to how to solve poverty. But Jesus was telling me to be the student and not the teacher. It felt horrifying and freeing. It was God's gentle or not so gentle way of telling me that any hopes our church had for our community were actually going to come from following and listening to the lead of this unpretentious, easy to overlook female Muslim leader. It shifted my gear from big, bold plans for our church to patiently waiting and listening, focusing on a real relationship with a real person. She taught me what was happening in our neighborhood and invited our church to be a part. It was a turning point where I felt like things actually started to happen in our neighborhood and not just well-to-do dreams in my mind. I learned that my neighbor wasn't a project or a program or a religious affiliation, but my neighbor was a person who God told me could be my teacher. So I don't know if you guys think about your neighbors or what neighborhood you grew up in or who you consider your neighborhood here in Wenham. But I do know that, as Zakiya mentioned, following Jesus leads us to our neighbors. And as I've spent the last 7 years working at a church thinking what Jesus has to do with my neighbor, I've started to wonder if loving our neighbors as ourselves is Jesus' way of challenging us to see and engage with our neighbors as whole people. John Perkins, who you saw in the video, went to Mississippi. He didn't plan to start a movement. He didn't know he would receive multiple honorary doctorates and that he would one day be the face of modern faith-based activism. All he knew was that he wanted to follow Jesus and tell people about Jesus. He was a very, very, very good evangelist. He had church services and outreach ministries and Bible studies and more Bible studies and more VBSs. And all he wanted people to know is that he wanted them to know about Jesus. But as he lived next to his black Mississippi neighbors, he started, at the Bible study, he started to see them maybe more as Bible study participants, but he started to know what else is going on in their lives. And in fact, eventually he learned that he said, as Zakiya mentioned, enough. There's some things happening here that need to stop. John is quoted as saying at the time, "I think I was starting to see that just being a merely fundamentalist, Bible-believing Christian, the Jesus saves only type, was not radical enough for the problems we were dealing with. People did need training, they did need skills, they did need jobs." You see, I don't know when in the Christian tradition we learned to separate body and mind, faith and action. We've definitely learned to care about the soul more often than not, and at times it just makes us weird. And sometimes it makes us really hurtful as Christians. I mean, we just do weird things when we only care about people's souls. You know, when Jesus was asked what the most important commandment was, he did in fact say the first was to love God with everything you have. But the second thing he said was to love your neighbor as yourself. Now, I've always been a little bit perplexed by this because I've spent a lot of my life not liking myself. A lot of time wishing and dreaming that I was better or funnier or smarter, definitely that I fit into skinny leg jeans better than I do. When I was at Gordon, I definitely wished I was that girl who I didn't really know, who got asked on dates. She might have only existed in my mind. But so it didn't seem like a good framework, hateful resentment that I had towards myself to have towards my neighbor. But here's the thing. I think we intuitively know when we take care of ourselves, we take care of ourselves as a whole person. We make sure we eat and sleep and shower. But somehow with our neighbors, we don't do that. So even though we know how to treat ourselves as whole people who are mind and body and soul, we separate one from the others. And when we're looking at our neighbor as only half a person, or we treat them as only half of a person. And I don't think that's what Jesus meant when he said to love our neighbors as ourselves. What if instead loving our neighbors as ourselves meant loving our neighbors as a whole person? Because I think if we can see our neighbors as a whole person, it leads us from treating our neighbors not like a project or not like a program, but it leads us to treating them as a friend. And you know, you treat your friends differently. Your friends, you spend time with them because you want to. You go to their house, they come to yours, you know about their family. You listen to them and believe in them. You care when things aren't right between your friends. The times when you're in fights, it weighs on your soul. We work to make things fair between our friends and share when there's a discrepancy in what's happening between us. When we see people as three-dimensional, living, breathing people, it changes how we interact. Treating people like whole people means we can receive from them. It helps us to see people's needs better, and it enables us to love people we didn't think we could love. I think that's why God told me that Sarah would be my teacher. It would be easy to just write her off as a Muslim, someone as a Christian I either needed to convert or not interact with. But when I see Sarah for all of who she is, she's more than just her religious affiliation. She was and is someone that I can receive from and work with, and someone that I can love. She was and is my teacher. As Dr. Perkins started to feel like his faith in Jesus led him to care more about where just people's souls stand, it led him to stand up and say, enough. He got busy. They started co-op programs and job training programs and tutoring programs. Eventually, they started to organize and rally their black neighbors and protest and demand that their black part of town be the same as the white part of town a mile away. All of this landed him in jail. It landed him in the Brandon County Jail, where he was beaten by white police officers for hours on end, called horrible names, and he was left in the cell in a pool of his own blood, basically to die. He miraculously survived and continued his work, but it left him with a lot of hate towards white people, as one might expect. But as he started to think, he didn't feel like there was room in his faith for hate, but he was really struck by he had so much hate. So he started to spend a lot of time thinking about these white people. Who are these white people? As a side note, I think it would be a good idea if all of us just spent a few minutes every day or every few months just thinking about white people. I think it's a good exercise. But he thought, God, who are these crazy damn white people? Expletives added. I'm sorry. He felt like he immediately saw this picture of a cross and felt like Jesus said to him, John, I died for them too. They too are your neighbor. You see, as John started to see his white neighbor not just as an enemy or an oppressor, he started to see them as a whole person. He was able to see that they were a broken person who needed God just like he did. He took Jesus' words seriously to love his white neighbor as himself, and he realized that his white neighbor wasn't his enemy, it was actually his neighbor who he could love and work with and receive from. This was a turning point in John's work and life and ministry, where he started calling people of faith, people like you and me, that having a part in working with people we didn't think we could love would be part of what following Jesus meant. The Jesus we know leads us to relationships of loving our neighbors as ourselves, the most life-giving and amazing and absolutely the most vulnerable thing you could ever do. You see, Jesus leads us not to triumphantly saving the world and saving their souls, but he leads us to day-by-day real relationships with him, with our neighbor, and with the most unlikely people possible. For me, as a white, college-educated, middle, upper-class female in the richest country in the world, loving my neighbor as myself has begun by starting to see my Muslim immigrant neighbor from one of the poorest countries in the world as my teacher and my friend.
For me, the most unlikely people possible are Michiganders, which you heard I am one now. It's not that I have anything inherently against Michigan. It's just that I'm a Tennessee girl. There's a lot that's crazy about the South, but there's a lot that's lovely and beautiful and warm about it. My family and friends, and then there's just so much about living in the South that is so valuable to me. So when I was there, I dreamed of moving overseas, of living in Chicago, or New York, California, even perhaps Boston, but I did not even think of visiting Michigan. I knew it was a good place for collegiate sports, automobile production, and having lots of African Americans in Detroit, which is on the opposite side of the state of me. So when God brought me to Grand Rapids last December in the dead of winter, he told me he had things for me to do in the city. And I was amazed and overwhelmed, and I had a lot of new neighbors. Following Jesus has led both Stephanie and I to our neighbors, and it's shown us some pretty radical applications of the Bible. Jeremiah 29:7 says, "And work for the peace and the prosperity of the city where I sent you into exile. Pray for it, for its welfare will determine your welfare." Our welfare is wrapped up in the welfare of those around us. For me in grad school, it was wrapped up in my friends from India, Russia, Palestine, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and so many other places, even New Mexico. I had never even heard of a New Mexican before, hardly. As I moved to Grand Rapids last December, I found that my welfare was not only wrapped up in the many struggling African Americans in the city, but the many middle class and upper class white people that I do life with every day. We all belong to each other. And I sense that God is continually asking me to be able to say, enough is enough, and make a change. And sometimes it will seem small, like what I'm going to eat or how much work I'm going to do today or whether or not I'm going to spend time with other people. And other times it will feel huge, like the stories we hear of Dr. Perkins. But regardless, at its core, it's still about following Jesus. Dr. Perkins and many others started CCDA for Christian Community Development Association, for people who follow Jesus to their neighbors. As Val mentioned, that's how all of us met. Sung-Chan Ra, Richard Twist, and Vince Bantu, who many of you got to hear from last year, we all know them as well from CCDA. And our leaders decided to invest in us so that we can continue to live this lifestyle. Well, a couple of years ago, after one of our retreats down in Jackson, Mississippi, where Dr. Perkins lives, I wrote a spoken word piece that I'll leave you with now. Stephanie and I hope that in your own life that you won't pursue a movement, but that you will pursue Jesus. He will take you to your neighbors, and that will be a movement. This piece is called Unjust Justice. Juxtaposition of unjustly served justice with millions of fatherless black babies waiting for daddy to come home. I used to hold some of those children daily, and they now live in my heart. They would ask in behavior and word and brokenness, when will daddy come home? When will he come home from jail, locked up for lesser sins than those overlooked by white cops when white men do white-collar crimes? What is a white-collar crime, really? But I digress. I'm trying to remember the words of our Dr. King. We stand on the worn thresholds of the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. So, Dr. King, my question for you is this: what cup do I drink of? Because I am eternally grateful for the justice that you and John Perkins, Diane Nash, Angela Davis, Maya Angelou, and many others brought us. For I know to be young, Black, and American in 2011 is much different and far more free than 1961. But it is still a social crime to be Black in America. So we sit on the threshold of the Palace of Justice, and President Obama got us closer. And I cried the night he was elected. And he spoke words of humility and of unity and restoration. But we're still so far. He said, Chicago 5th, 2008, we need to heal the divide that holds back our progress. January 2011, Tucson, Arizona. We need to speak words of healing to each other. But how? How do we speak words that heal when injustice still prevails in our prisons and in our economy? African Americans who apply for small business loans are denied twice as much as Caucasians with similar credit worthiness, according to the National Bureau of Economic Research. Both of my parents tried to own small businesses, and it didn't work. So when I go to a bank and apply for that loan and they say, no, what are the words that heal? Do I drink from a cup of bitterness? Or do I drink from something else? The funny thing about bitterness is that it actually serves to push people away instead of drawing them in for healing. So I'll be stronger than that, and I'll be more strategic, and I'll love deeper, and I'll fight harder. I'll remember that change comes from ordinary people who imagined a new world, and people who knew when enough was enough. So join me as we join Dr. Perkins. Let's heal our land and heal each other and erase the footprint of oppression, because we will force our oppressors to face us and therefore face themselves. Hope, though not a swift remedy, tastes much better than bitterness.